Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I've decided to go back to an old modded world since I thought it would be nice to try something new. Today I got some scary stories that will make you... Did anyone else see that? Anyway, let me know what you guys think about modded Minecraft. I apologise for that being the first encounter you see after I booted this up. But other than that, grab a snack, get comfortable and let's dive right in. Our first story comes from someone who thought they knew their neighbour until they discovered what was really happening next door. I live in a quiet suburban neighbourhood where everyone keeps to themselves. The kind of place where the biggest drama is usually someone forgetting to bring their trash cans in on time. My next door neighbour Derek moved in about 8 months ago, and at first he seemed completely normal. Mid-30s, kept his lawn neat, drove a sensible Honda Civic. But then the digging started. It began around 3 months ago. Always at night, always between midnight and 3 in the morning, I'd hear the rhythmic scraping of a shovel against dirt coming from his backyard. At first I figured he was doing some late-night gardening project, maybe installing a sprinkler system or planting trees. People do weird home improvement stuff all the time, right? Except the digging never stopped and nothing ever seemed to grow. From my upstairs bedroom window, I could see into his backyard. And every few nights there would be Derek hunched over a different spot, methodically digging holes about 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide. He'd spend hours on each one, the soft thud of dirt being moved echoing through the quiet night. Then he'd disappear inside and come back carrying something wrapped in what looked like black garbage bags. He'd lower whatever it was into the hole, fill it back up and move on to the next spot after 2 months of this. His entire backyard looked like a patchwork of disturbed earth. Dozens of small rectangular patches. Where the grass hadn't grown back yet, it looked like a miniature cemetery. My wife thought I was being paranoid when I brought it up. She said maybe he was composting or burying pet waste. But something about the whole thing felt wrong. The secretive timing, the careful wrapping, the way he'd look around nervously before starting each dig. That's when I decided to find out what he was burying last weekend. While Derek was at work, I climbed the fence separating our properties. My heart was pounding as I stood in his backyard, looking at all those disturbed patches of earth up close. They were even more unsettling, perfectly uniform in size and spacing, like he'd measured everything out with military precision. I brought a small gardening spade and chose a spot near the back corner that looked like one of the more recent burial sites. The dirt was still loose and it didn't take long to hit something solid. About 2 feet down, my hands were shaking as I brushed away the soil and pulled out a black garbage bag. It was heavier than I expected, and when I untied the knot at the top and peeled back the plastic, I nearly dropped it inside. Was a phone? Not just any phone, but an expensive-looking smartphone. In perfect condition, still in its original box with all the accessories and documentation. I stared at it, confused. This wasn't what I'd been expecting at all. Where were the body parts or stolen goods or whatever sinister thing I'd convinced myself Derek was hiding? Derek. But then I noticed something else at the bottom of the bag. There was a small notebook with an entry written in Derek's handwriting. iPhone 14 Pro, purchased March 15th. Retail value $909. Buried March 18th location. Grid reference B7. I quickly dug up 2 more bags from nearby spots. Each one contained expensive electronics still in their original packaging. Laptops, tablets, gaming consoles, wireless headphones. All brand new, all carefully catalogued in Derek's notebook with purchase dates, burial locations and retail values. The total value of just those 3 bags was over $4,000. I sat there in his backyard, surrounded by holes and buried treasure, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Derek wasn't burying bodies or stolen goods. He was burying his own purchases, thousands of dollars worth of electronics that he'd bought and immediately hidden underground, like some kind of twisted time capsule project. But why that night I couldn't sleep? I kept thinking about all those buried devices, slowly deteriorating in the damp soil. While Derek went about his normal life, it was like he was creating his own personal landfill of perfectly good technology that no one would ever use the next morning. I was getting my mail when Derek walked over to chat, something he'd never done before. "Hey neighbour," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "How's everything going?" "Fine," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just enjoying the weekend, you know." He continued, his eyes scanning my face carefully. "I've been thinking about getting a security camera system for the backyard. Been having some issues with animals getting into my garden." "Animals?" I repeated. "Yeah," he nodded, still watching me closely. "Raccoons. Mostly they've been digging up my yard, making a real mess of things." We stared at each other for a long moment, and I realised he knew that. I knew the thing is I never found out why Derek was burying all those electronics. I never confronted him about it, and he never admitted to knowing that I'd discovered his secret. But the digging stopped that week, and within a month, Derek had moved out of the house entirely. The new owners renovated the entire backyard, and I wonder sometimes if they found the dozens of devices still buried under there, or if Derek came back one night to dig them all up. I still drive past that house sometimes, and the yard looks normal now. Green grass, flower beds, a small patio, but I know what's underneath, and I can't shake the feeling that Derek is somewhere else now, in another quiet neighbourhood, starting another collection. That story is over, and honestly, I don't know what's more disturbing, the fact that someone would bury thousands of dollars worth of electronics, or the fact that he was so methodical about it, the notebook entries, the grid system, the perfect spacing. It's like he turned hoarding into some kind of underground science experiment, and the way he knew that his neighbour had figured it out, just from a casual conversation about raccoons, that's genuinely unsettling. Let's move on to our next story, which comes from someone who discovered that their childhood memories weren't quite what they seemed. I found my old diary from when I was 7, and the entries don't match my memories at all. Cleaning out my parents' house after they moved to Florida, I came across a box of my childhood things buried in the back of the closet. Mostly the usual stuff: old toys, school projects, a few books I'd forgotten about, but at the bottom, wrapped in a faded pink pillowcase, was my diary from 2nd grade. I remembered that diary clearly. It had been a gift from my Aunt Carol for my 7th birthday, pale blue with a tiny padlock and key. I'd been so excited to have a real diary. Like the older girls at school, I carried it everywhere for months, writing down everything that seemed important to my 7-year-old brain. Sitting on the floor of my childhood bedroom, I opened it expecting to find innocent entries about playground drama, and what I had for lunch instead, what I found made my blood run cold. The first entry was dated September 15th and written in my careful 2nd grade handwriting. "Dear Diary, Mommy. And Daddy had another big fight last night. Daddy threw his plate at the wall and Mommy cried in the kitchen. I hid under my bed until it got quiet. The man with the dark hair came to visit again today. He brings Mommy flowers, but Daddy doesn't like him." I stared at the page, confused. I had no memory of my parents fighting when I was 7. In fact, my childhood memories were filled with family game nights and weekend trips to the zoo. My parents had always seemed happy together. They'd been married for 38 years before my dad passed away last spring. But as I kept reading, the entries painted a completely different picture. September 22nd. The man with dark hair stayed for dinner. Daddy was at work. Mommy told me to call him Uncle James. But he's not really my uncle. He tickles me too much and his hands are cold. October 1st. Mommy packed a suitcase today. She said we might go on a trip. But then Daddy came home early and she unpacked everything really fast. They whispered a lot in the kitchen and Mommy's eyes were red. October 8th. Uncle James brought me a new stuffed animal, but Daddy took it away and put it in the trash. He said strangers shouldn't give me presents. Mommy and Daddy yelled so loud that neighbour came over to check. Page after page of entries describing a household in chaos, parents fighting mysterious visits from Uncle James, late-night arguments, and a 7-year-old girl trying to make sense of adult problems that were way beyond her understanding. But here's the thing that really scared me. I remembered none of it according to my diary. This went on for months. My parents on the verge of separation. My mother apparently having an emotional affair with someone named James. Me caught in the middle, documenting everything in my innocent child's handwriting. But in my actual memories that year was peaceful and happy. I called my older sister Jenny to ask if she remembered anything about our parents having problems when we were kids. Problems, she laughed. What are you talking about? Mom and Dad were like the perfect couple. They never even raised their voices at each other. But what about someone named James? I pressed. Did Mum have a friend named James? When we were little, Jenny was quiet for a moment, then said, "Why are you asking these weird questions?" I told her about the diary, and she insisted on coming over to see it for herself. When she arrived and read through the entries, her face went pale. "This is impossible," she whispered. Mum and Dad never fought, and there was never any James I would have remembered. We sat there staring at the diary, both of us completely baffled. The handwriting was definitely mine. The details were too specific and consistent to be made up, but neither of us had any memory of the events described. That's when Jenny noticed something else. "Look at this," she said, pointing to one of the entries. The date says October 15th, but look at the entry before it, October 8th, and the one after October 22nd. She was right. The dates were out of sequence. As we flipped through more carefully, we realised that several pages had been torn out, cleanly removed, so that you could barely tell they'd ever been there. Someone had edited my childhood diary. We spent the next hour going through every entry, trying to piece together what had been removed, based on the remaining fragments. It seemed like whatever happened reached some kind of climax in late October, and then suddenly the tone of the entries changed completely. November 3rd, Mommy made pancakes this morning, and Daddy sang songs in the shower. Everything feels normal again. Uncle James hasn't visited in a long time. Maybe he went on a trip. November 10th, Jenny and I played dress up, and Mommy helped us do our hair. Daddy came home with flowers for Mommy, and they danced in the kitchen from November. On the entries read, exactly like what I remembered. A happy, normal family doing happy, normal things. But those earlier months painted a completely different picture, and someone had deliberately removed parts of the story. Jenny and I agreed not to tell our mother about finding the diary she'd been through. Enough grief losing Dad, and we didn't want to dredge up painful memories from decades ago, but we both left that day with more questions than answers. Who was James? What really happened in our house that fall? Why did someone edit my diary? And most disturbing of all, how could both Jenny and I have completely forgotten months of family trauma? Sometimes I wonder if the diary entries were accurate and our memories are wrong, or if 7-year-old me had an overactive imagination and wrote down fears instead of facts. But the torn out pages suggest someone wanted to hide something, and the fact that 2 adults have no memory of events that apparently went on for months makes me think there's more to this story. I still have the diary, and sometimes late at night I'll read through those early entries trying to unlock some buried memory. But it's like trying to remember a dream that's already fading. The harder I focus, the more elusive it becomes. That story's finished, and I have to say the idea that someone edited a child's diary is absolutely chilling. Like, imagine going through a 7-year-old's private thoughts and carefully removing specific pages to hide some family secret. The fact that both siblings have zero memory of what sounds like months of serious family drama makes you wonder what else our minds choose to forget, or what other people choose to help us forget. Our next story comes from someone who thought they were helping a stranger, but discovered something much more sinister was going on. There's a woman who sits in the same coffee shop every day, writing letters to dead people. And I read one by accident. I work remotely, so I spend a lot of time in coffee shops around the city. There's this one place called Grind Coffee that has the perfect setup. Good Wi-Fi, comfortable chairs, and they don't mind if you camp out for hours with just one drink. About 2 months ago, I started noticing this woman who would come in every single day. At exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, she looked to be in her 60s, well dressed with silver hair, always pulled back in a neat bun. She'd order the same thing, every time large black coffee, no sugar, and then sit at the corner table by the window. What caught my attention was that she'd spend hours writing letters by hand with an expensive looking fountain pen. She'd write for maybe 30 or 40 minutes per letter, Fold it carefully and put it in an envelope. Then start another one. She'd usually finish 3 or 4 letters during her visit. At first I figured she was just old-fashioned. Maybe she had grandchildren or friends who appreciated handwritten correspondence in our digital age. It seemed sweet, actually, like a connection to a more personal time, but then I started noticing the envelopes. She never sealed them, and she never addressed them. She'd just write the letters, fold them up, and stack the envelopes in a neat pile beside her coffee cup. When she was done for the day, she'd gather everything up and leave. Taking all the letters with her, curiosity got the better of me, and I started paying more attention to her routine. She came every day, except Sundays, always at 2:30, always the same table, always the same methodical letter-writing process. She never spoke to anyone, never made phone calls, just wrote in complete silence for about 2 hours. Last week, something happened that changed everything. I was sitting at my usual spot working on a client presentation when the woman arrived for her daily session, but this time she seemed agitated. She kept looking around nervously, and her handwriting was more hurried than usual. About halfway through her first letter, she suddenly stood up and rushed to the bathroom, leaving everything on the table, including the letter she'd been writing. I know I shouldn't have, but the envelope was right there, just a few feet away. And after weeks of wondering what she was writing about, I couldn't resist. I glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then quickly leaned over and read the visible portion of the letter. "Dear Michael," it began, "I hope you're not angry that I haven't visited your grave in so long. The doctors say I shouldn't drive anymore, and taking the bus is so difficult. But I think about you every day. I still make your favourite dinner every Sunday, even though there's no one to eat it with me." I felt terrible for invading her privacy, but I was also confused. This seemed like a normal letter from a widow to her deceased husband. Except for one thing, the envelope had a name written on it in pencil. Not Michael, but Robert. When she came back from the bathroom, I pretended to be absorbed in my work, but I kept watching her out of the corner of my eye. She finished the letter to Michael, folded it and put it in the envelope, marked Robert. Then she started a new letter. This time, I was paying closer attention and I could see the beginning of the second letter as she wrote it. "Dear Susan, I know you're probably wondering why I never called after the funeral, but the truth is I couldn't handle seeing everyone pretend." They weren't relieved. "You were finally gone." My stomach dropped. This definitely wasn't a normal letter to a deceased loved one. And when she folded it up, she put it in an envelope, marked Janet over the next hour. I watched her write 2 more letters, each one going into an envelope, with a completely different name than the person addressed in the letter. Every single envelope had a different name written in pencil, while the letters inside were addressed to someone else entirely. When she left that day, I couldn't concentrate on work. I kept thinking about what I'd witnessed. Why would someone write letters to dead people and then put them in envelopes with the wrong names? It didn't make sense unless she wasn't actually writing to dead people at all. The next day I made sure to arrive early and chose a seat with a better view of her table. When she came in at her usual time, I watched more carefully than ever, and what I saw made my blood run cold. She wasn't just writing random letters, she was copying them. She had a small notebook that she'd pull out occasionally to check details, and when she thought no one was looking, she'd refer to what looked like a list of names and addresses. The letters weren't spontaneous, grief correspondence. They were carefully planned copies of something else. And then I saw her do something that made everything click into place. After finishing her third letter, she pulled out her phone and took a photo of it before folding it up and putting it in the mismatched envelope. She was documenting everything that night. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those letters and what they might really be the next morning. I did something that probably makes me a terrible person, but I couldn't let it go. I followed her. When she left the coffee shop at her usual time around 4:30, I waited a minute, then walked out behind her. She moved slowly using a walking cane, but with purpose, like she knew exactly where she was going. She walked 4 blocks to the post office. I watched from across the street as she went inside and emerged 20 minutes later without the stack of envelopes she'd been carrying. She'd actually mailed them all. Those letters with mismatched names and addresses had been sent to real people, but here's what really scared me when she came out of the post office. She looked directly at me, standing across the street, and smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a confused elderly woman, wondering why a stranger was watching her, but a knowing, calculating smile. Like she'd been aware of my attention all along. I haven't been back to that coffee shop since, but I can't stop thinking about those letters. What was in them? Who were they really for? And why did she want photographic proof that she'd sent them? Sometimes I wonder if I should have called the police or tried to intervene somehow. But what would I have said that an elderly woman was writing letters in a coffee shop? There's nothing illegal about that, even if the whole thing felt deeply wrong. But that smile she gave me outside the post office haunts me, because it suggested that whatever she was doing, she knew exactly how it looked to an outside observer. And she didn't care that story ends there. And honestly, this might be the most unsettling one yet, because there's something so sinister about the methodical nature of it. The daily routine, the careful documentation, the mismatched names and addresses. It's like she was running some kind of psychological warfare campaign through the mail system, and the fact that she knew she was being watched and didn't care suggests this wasn't some confused elderly woman, but someone with a very specific and probably malicious plan. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that their roommate had been living a double life for months. My roommate has been pretending to go to work every day, but I found out she hasn't had a job in 6 months. I've been living with Rachel for almost 2 years now, and she's always been the responsible type. Pays her half of rent on time, keeps common areas, clean, goes to bed early, because she has to be at the office by 8 in the morning. She works in marketing for some tech company downtown, or at least that's what I thought. Every weekday morning, like clockwork, she'd get up at 6:30, shower, get dressed in business, casual clothes, grab her laptop bag and head out the door. She'd come home around 6 in the evening, looking appropriately tired from a day at the office. We'd chat about our days over dinner, and she'd always have normal work stories about meetings and deadlines and difficult clients. Nothing seemed off until about 3 weeks ago, when I got sick with food poisoning and had to stay home from my own job. I was camped out on the couch feeling miserable, when around 10 in the morning I heard Rachel's key in the front door. She walked in looking surprised to see me there and quickly explained that she'd forgotten an important file and had to come back to get it. She grabbed something from her room and left again, but something about the interaction felt weird. She seemed nervous, almost panicked the next day. I was still recovering, so I stayed home again. And sure enough, around 10:15, Rachel came back. She used the same excuse about forgetting something important, but this time I noticed she wasn't carrying anything when she left. That's when I started paying attention. Over the next week, I made excuses to work from home. A few days, and every single time Rachel would return to the apartment, between 10 and 11 in the morning, she'd stay for about an hour, then leave again, always with some story about forgotten documents or client calls she needed to take from home. But here's what really tipped me off. She never actually took anything with her. And when she thought I wasn't looking, I could see her, through the kitchen window, sitting in her car in our parking lot. Just sitting there scrolling on her phone for 20 or 30 minutes. Before driving away last Friday, I decided to follow her. I waited until she left for her supposed job, then got in my car and drove the route she always took toward downtown. I expected to lose her in traffic, or see her pull into some office building parking garage. Instead, she drove to the public library. She parked, walked inside, and I watched through the windows as she found a quiet corner table, pulled out her laptop, and settled in like she was planning to stay for hours. I sat in my car for 2 hours, and she never moved from that spot, just typing away on her laptop, occasionally getting up to browse the shelves, but mostly just sitting there, doing whatever people do when they're pretending to be at work. When I got home that evening, I acted normal, asked about her day, and she launched into this elaborate story about a difficult client presentation and how her boss was being unreasonable about deadlines. She was so convincing, so detailed in her complaints, that I almost believed her, except I knew she'd spent the entire day at the library. The next Monday, I tried a different approach. I called her office number that she'd given me when we first moved in together. The number that was supposedly her direct line, the recording said the number was no longer in service. That's when I started digging. I looked up the company she claimed to work for and searched their employee directory online. No Rachel anywhere to be found. I checked LinkedIn and found her profile, but it showed her last job ending 8 months ago with no current employment listed. She'd been unemployed for 8 months, but had only been living this elaborate lie for about 6 of them because I distinctly remembered her talking about starting a new position back in April. So where was she getting money for rent, for groceries, for all the takeout she ordered? I decided to check our joint utility accounts online and discovered something that made my stomach drop. She'd been paying her portion of everything with a credit card. Not just occasionally, but every single payment for the past 6 months. Rent, utilities, groceries, even her car payment, all going on credit. I calculated roughly how much debt she must have accumulated, and the number was staggering, probably close to $30,000 and climbing every month. But the really disturbing part was how elaborate the deception had become. She'd created an entire fictional work life, complete with co-workers. She'd complain about projects she was supposedly working on, office drama and company policies. She'd make up stories about her commute, about the coffee in the break room, about her parking situation. She'd even started bringing home fake work stress, talking about how tired she was from long days and difficult meetings. She'd complain about her boss sending emails after hours and how she might need to work some weekends, all of it completely fabricated last Tuesday. I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until she came home from her fake job and confronted her directly. "Rachel," I said, sitting her down in our living room, "we need to talk about your work situation." Her face went white, but she tried to maintain the facade. "What do you mean?" "Everything's fine, just the usual office stress." "I know you don't have a job," I said gently. "I know you've been going to the library every day, and I know you've been paying for everything with credit cards." The silence that followed was deafening. She just stared at me for what felt like forever, then completely broke down, sobbing harder than I'd ever seen anyone cry. The truth came pouring out. She'd been laid off 8 months ago when her company downsized, but she was too embarrassed to tell me. She kept meaning to find something new. But the job market was brutal, and she kept getting rejected. Every interview that didn't go well, every application that got ignored, just made her feel more worthless. So she started pretending at first it was just supposed to be for a week or two until she found something new. But weeks turned into months, and the lie got bigger and more complicated. She was spending her days at the library, applying for jobs and freelancing when she could find work, but mostly just maintaining the illusion that everything was normal. She'd maxed out 3 credit cards, keeping up with her share of expenses, and was terrified that I'd kick her out. If I knew the truth, she said she'd been planning to tell me once she found a real job, but every day that passed made it harder to come clean. We talked for hours that night, and I realised that Rachel wasn't malicious or trying to scam me. She was just scared and ashamed, and had gotten trapped in a lie that grew beyond her control. She moved out 2 weeks later. Not because I asked her to, but because she couldn't handle the shame of having deceived me for so long. She left a note apologising and promising to pay back any money she owed once she got back on her feet. I haven't heard from her since, but sometimes I wonder how many other people are out there living similar lies, going through the motions of normal life, while everything falls apart behind the scenes. That story hits differently, because you can almost understand how someone gets trapped in that kind of deception. The shame of job loss spiralling into elaborate lies about fake work days. It's like social media, but taken to an extreme level, where you're performing success for your roommate instead of strangers online. The library detail really gets me though, spending 8 hours a day pretending to be at an office job, while actually just sitting at a public computer, desperately applying for real work. That's genuinely heartbreaking, even if the lying was wrong. Let's move to something that might make your skin crawl a bit more. This next story comes from someone who discovered their landlord had been making some very unwelcome visits. I installed a security camera in my apartment and found out my landlord has been coming inside while I'm at work, living alone in a city apartment. It comes with its own set of anxieties, but I'd always felt relatively safe in my building. It's a converted brownstone with only 4 units, and my landlord Gary seemed like a decent guy in his 50s, who lived in the basement unit and handled all the maintenance himself. I'd been living there for about 8 months, when small things started feeling off. Nothing I could put my finger on. At first, just a general sense that things weren't quite where I'd left them. It started with my bathroom cabinet. I keep my medications organised in a very specific way because I take several prescriptions at different times of day. But I'd come home and find bottles moved around or turned differently than how I'd left them. Then I noticed my kitchen seemed different too, spices rearranged in the cabinet dishes in the dishwasher that I didn't remember putting there. My coffee maker moved slightly to the left on the counter. I started thinking maybe I was losing my mind or just not paying attention to where I put things. Stress from work was pretty high, and I figured maybe I was more scattered than usual, but then I found a coffee mug in my sink that I'd never seen before. It was a plain white mug, nothing special, but definitely not one of mine. I only owned 4 mugs and I knew each one by heart. This was a 5th mug sitting in my sink, like it belonged there when I asked Gary about it. The next time I saw him, he claimed he'd been in to fix a leaky pipe under the kitchen sink and had made himself some coffee. He apologised for not asking first, but said it was just easier than going back downstairs to his own apartment. That seemed reasonable enough, except I hadn't reported any leaky pipe, and when I checked under the sink, everything looked fine. No signs of recent repair work, no water damage, no new parts. That's when I decided to install a security camera. I bought a small wireless camera online and set it up in my living room, positioned so it could see the front door and most of the main living space. I didn't tell Gary about it because, honestly, I was hoping I'd just capture myself being forgetful and put the whole thing to rest. The first few days showed nothing unusual, just me leaving for work in the morning and coming home in the evening. But on Thursday of that week, I got a notification on my phone that the camera had detected motion. In my apartment, I was at work, so I pulled up the live feed and watched as Gary unlocked my front door and walked inside. He didn't seem to be there for any maintenance purpose. He just wandered around my living room, picking up books from my coffee table, examining framed photos, looking through mail that was sitting on my counter. He spent about 20 minutes just browsing through my personal belongings, like he was shopping at a store. Then he went into my kitchen, opened my refrigerator, and helped himself to some leftover Chinese food. After eating, he washed the dish he'd used and put it away, then continued exploring my apartment. He went through my bathroom medicine cabinet, again this time, actually opening prescription bottles and reading the labels. The whole thing was surreal, watching someone move through my private space with such casual entitlement, like he owned not just the building, but everything in it. When he finally left, he locked the door behind him, and everything looked normal again. If I hadn't been watching live, I never would have known he'd been there. I saved the video and started checking the camera feed more regularly. Over the next week, Gary came into my apartment 4 more times, always during work hours, always for about 20 to 30 minutes. His routine was consistent. He'd look through my mail, check what food I had available, sometimes eat something, then browse through my personal belongings. He seemed particularly interested in my bedroom, going through my dresser drawers and examining clothes in my closet, but the most disturbing visit happened the following Tuesday. I was watching the live feed during my lunch break when Gary entered as usual, but this time he had a notebook with him. He sat at my kitchen table and started writing detailed notes about everything he observed, what groceries I'd bought recently, what books I was reading, what medications I was taking, even what shows were queued up on my Netflix account. He was documenting my entire life, like I was some kind of research subject. He also took photos with his phone, pictures of my mail, my prescription bottles, my personal documents, anything that contained information about my identity or daily routine. That's when I realised this wasn't just casual snooping, this was systematic invasion of privacy with some kind of specific purpose. I called the police that afternoon and showed them the videos. They were as disturbed as I was and agreed to set up a sting operation the next day. I'd leave for work as normal, but officers would be positioned outside to arrest Gary when he entered illegally. Sure enough, the next morning, about 2 hours after I left, Gary unlocked my door and walked inside. The officers were waiting for him when they searched his apartment. They found notebooks filled with detailed information about all 4 tenants in the building, our schedules, our habits, our personal information, our vulnerabilities. He'd been systematically spying on everyone. They also found spare keys to every apartment in the building and evidence that he'd been entering other units regularly, not just mine. Turns out Gary had a history of this behaviour. He'd been evicted from his previous property management job for similar violations and had multiple restraints, orders filed against him by former tenants. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of breaking and entering and stalking. The building owner immediately terminated his lease and management contract. I moved out the following month because even knowing he was in jail, I couldn't feel safe in that apartment anymore. Every time I came home, I'd wonder what he'd touched, what he'd seen, what private moments he'd violated. The worst part wasn't even the invasion of privacy. It was realizing how long it had been going on and how completely unaware I'd been. Gary had been living a parallel life inside my apartment, documenting my existence. Like I was an exhibit in his personal museum. That story is absolutely chilling, and honestly, this is why security cameras exist. The systematic documentation, the photos, the notebooks full of tenant information that goes way beyond casual snooping into full stalker territory, and the fact that he had keys to every apartment means he was probably doing this to multiple people. The detail about him eating her leftover Chinese food, like he lived there, is somehow both mundane and deeply violating at the same time. This story comes from someone who thought they were helping their elderly neighbour, but discovered something much darker. My elderly neighbour asked me to help her move some furniture, and I found a room full of missing person posters. I've always been the type of person who helps out neighbours, especially elderly ones. So when Mrs. Chen from next door asked if I could help her rearrange some furniture in her spare room, I didn't hesitate to say yes. Mrs. Chen had lived next to my family for over 15 years. She was in her 70s, quiet and polite, always kept her yard immaculate, and occasionally brought over homemade cookies. During holidays, she seemed like the perfect neighbour. When I knocked on her door last Saturday morning, she seemed more nervous than usual, fidgeting with her hands and avoiding eye contact. But she led me upstairs to a room I'd never seen before. The room was completely empty, except for a large wooden desk pushed against one wall and several cardboard boxes stacked in the corner. She explained that she wanted to move the desk to the opposite wall and rearrange the boxes to make space for a new bookshelf. Simple enough, except when I started moving the desk, I noticed something strange. The wall behind it was covered in papers, dozens of them taped directly to the wallpaper, and when I looked closer, I realised they were all missing person posters. Not old yellowed posters that had been there for years, but recent ones. Some looked like they'd been printed just days ago. They showed people of all ages, men, women, teenagers, children, all with different locations and dates, but one thing connected them. They were all from our city and surrounding areas. Mrs. Chen noticed me staring and quickly moved to block my view. She said something about collecting them because she worried about safety in the neighbourhood, but her explanation didn't make sense. Why would someone tape missing person posters to a wall in their spare room? I helped her move the desk as requested, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. There had to be at least 30 or 40 posters covering that entire wall, some of them overlapping like they'd been accumulating for years. When we finished moving the furniture, Mrs. Chen thanked me quickly and walked me to the door. But as I was leaving, I noticed something else. Her kitchen table was covered with newspaper clippings, all folded and sorted into neat piles, and from what I could see, they were all articles about disappearances and unsolved cases. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mrs. Chen and that room full of missing person posters. The next morning, I did something that probably makes me a terrible neighbour, but I had to know more. I started researching the missing persons cases. I could remember from her wall what I found made my blood run cold. Several of the people on those posters had last been seen in our neighbourhood. One woman had disappeared after leaving a grocery store. Just 3 blocks from our street, a teenage boy had vanished while walking home from school, along the route that passed right by Mrs. Chen's house. But the detail that really scared me was the timeline. The disappearances went back over 10 years, and they seemed to cluster around specific times of year, mostly late fall and early winter, always during months when it gets dark early. I spent hours online cross-referencing missing person reports, with dates and locations, and a pattern emerged that made me sick to my stomach. Almost every disappearance happened within a 5-mile radius of our neighbourhood, and in several cases witnesses had reported seeing the missing person talking to an elderly Asian woman shortly before they vanished. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The next day I called the police and told them about the room full of missing person posters. They seemed sceptical at first, but agreed to do a welfare check on Mrs. Chen. When the officers arrived at her house, she wouldn't let them inside, claimed she was feeling unwell, and asked them to come back another time, but they could see enough through the windows to justify a search warrant. What they found in her house changed everything. The spare room wasn't just covered in missing person posters. It was like a command centre for tracking disappearances. She had detailed maps marked with locations and dates, notebooks filled with information about missing persons and photographs that she'd apparently taken of people around the neighbourhood. But the most disturbing discovery was in her basement. They found personal belongings that had belonged to several of the missing people. Jewellery identification cards, items that the families had reported missing. Along with their loved ones, Mrs. Chen was arrested and charged with multiple counts of kidnapping and murder during questioning. She confessed to luring people to her house. Over the course of more than a decade, she'd target vulnerable individuals, people who were alone or lost, and offer them help or shelter. Once they were inside her house, she'd drug them and keep them imprisoned in a hidden room in her basement. The details of what happened to those people are too disturbing to repeat, but Mrs. Chen had been operating as a serial killer for over 15 years, right next door to my family. The house has been empty since her arrest, and it's scheduled for demolition next month. But I still can't walk past it without feeling sick knowing what was happening, just a few feet from where my family slept every night. Sometimes I wonder how many times I waved hello to Mrs. Chen while she was actively holding someone prisoner in her basement. How many times I accepted cookies from someone who was systematically murdering our neighbours. The scariest part is how normal she seemed, how perfectly she blended into the neighbourhood. No one suspected anything because she looked exactly like what you'd expect a harmless elderly woman to look like. Yeah, this story's going to stay with me for a while. The idea that someone could live next door to a serial killer for 15 years without knowing is absolutely terrifying. But it happens more often than we'd like to think. The detail about her having a command centre of missing person posters, like she was collecting trophies or planning her next victim, is genuinely haunting. And the fact that she specifically targeted vulnerable people who wouldn't immediately be missed shows a level of calculated evil that's hard to comprehend. This next story is quite an unsettling one. Someone has been leaving me voicemails pretending to be my dead sister, and they know things only she would know. My sister Lily died in a car accident 3 years ago. She was 26, and we were incredibly close. Talked every day, shared everything, the kind of relationship where we could finish each other's sentences and knew exactly what the other was thinking. Losing her was devastating, but over time, I've learned to cope with the grief. I kept her phone number in my contacts, even though the line was disconnected months after she passed. Sometimes, I'd still try to call it just to hear her voicemail, greeting one more time, until eventually that stopped working too. Last month, something impossible started happening. I began receiving voicemails on my phone from Lily's old number. The first one came at 2 a.m. I woke up to a notification and saw her name on my screen. My heart stopped for a moment before logic kicked in. Obviously, It was some kind of technical glitch, or maybe the phone company had reassigned her number to someone else, but when I played the message, it was her voice, not similar to her voice, not someone who sounded like her, but definitely, unmistakably Lily. Talking in that slightly raspy tone she had from years of smoking, speaking with the same cadence and inflections I'd heard thousands of times. "Hey Jamie," the voicemail said, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I needed to tell you something. Remember that time we snuck out to go to that party at Derek's house when we were in high school, and you were so scared Mum would find out that you made me promise to take all the blame if we got caught? Well, I lied to you that night. I never would have let you take the fall for anything we did together. You were my little sister, and protecting you was always my job. The message ended there, and I sat in my bed shaking. Nobody else knew about that night. We'd never told our parents. We got away with it and never spoke about it again, except once, years later, when Lily mentioned how guilty she felt for making me sneak out in the first place. But here's the thing that made it truly impossible. Lily had gotten that story wrong in the voicemail. She said I was her little sister, but Lily was actually 2 years younger than me. She was always my little sister. Not the other way around. It was the kind of mistake that someone pretending to be Lily might make. If they didn't know our family well enough, I tried calling the number back, but it went straight to a generic voicemail box that wasn't set up the kind of automated message you get when a line isn't fully activated over the next 2 weeks. I received 4 more voicemails, all from Lily's number, all in her voice. The second message was about our childhood dog, Rusty. "Hey Jamie, I've been thinking about Rusty a lot lately. Remember how he used to sleep between our beds? And whenever one of us had a nightmare, he'd somehow know and come cuddle with whoever needed him most. I miss that feeling of knowing someone was always watching out for us again." The details were perfect, but there was something slightly off. Lily called our dog Rusty, but his actual name was Russell. We only called him Rusty when he was in trouble. Like when Mum would yell, "Russell James Thompson, get off that couch." But in casual conversation, Lily always used his full name. The third voicemail mentioned our grandmother's secret recipe for chocolate chip cookies. The fourth one brought up a fight we'd had in college over a boy we both liked. Each message contained intimate family memories that only Lily could have known, but each one also had small inconsistencies, details that were almost right, but not quite by the fifth voicemail. I was convinced someone was playing an elaborate, cruel prank on me. Maybe they'd somehow accessed Lily's social media or talked to mutual friends to piece together these stories, but the voice was so perfect, so exactly like hers, that I couldn't figure out how anyone could fake it. That's when I decided to set a trap. I knew that Lily had kept a diary throughout high school and college, filled with secrets she'd never shared with anyone, including me after she died. I'd found it among her belongings and read through it looking for some sense of closure. There were entries in that diary that no one else could possibly know about, so I waited for the next voicemail, and when it came, I was ready. "Hey Jamie," the voice said, "I've been thinking about senior year and how scared I was about college. Remember how I used to sneak into your room at night because I was having panic attacks about leaving home? I never told you this, but I wrote about those fears in my diary every night. I was so worried about being away from family, about making new friends, about whether I was smart enough to succeed. I felt my blood turn to ice. Lily had never snuck into my room. During senior year, she'd never had panic attacks about college. In fact, she'd been excited to leave home and start fresh at a school 3 states away. But more importantly, she'd never told anyone about her diary, including me. Whoever was leaving these voicemails had read Lily's private thoughts. I immediately called the police and played them the messages. They took it seriously enough to start an investigation, but explained that voice spoofing technology had become incredibly sophisticated. In recent years, someone with the right software and enough audio samples could recreate almost anyone's voice. But that didn't explain how they had accessed Lily's diary. The detective assigned to my case suggested that someone might have broken into Lily's apartment after her death, or possibly bribed someone at the estate sale where her belongings were supposed to have been sold. But I'd handled all of that myself. and I was certain the diary had never left my possession. That's when I realised something that made me feel sick. I hadn't been the only one to read Lily's diary about 6 months after she died. I'd lent it to her best friend Jessica, who said she wanted to feel close to Lily one more time. Jessica had kept it for several weeks before returning it, and during that time she'd had access to every secret, every fear, every private thought Lily had ever written down. When I confronted Jessica about the voicemails, she broke down immediately. She admitted to creating them using an AI voice cloning service, and Lily's old Instagram videos as source material. She'd been struggling with grief and couldn't accept that Lily was really gone, so she'd started leaving herself voicemails pretending Lily was trying to communicate from beyond, but then she'd accidentally sent one to my number instead of her own, and when she saw how much it affected me, she couldn't bring herself to admit the mistake. Instead, she kept sending more, trying to give me the same comfort she'd been giving herself. The voicemail stopped after that confrontation, but the damage was done. For weeks, I'd been living in this strange liminal space between hope and terror, believing that maybe somehow Lily was trying to reach me from wherever she was. Learning the truth was almost worse than losing her all over again, because for a brief moment she'd felt alive again. Her voice in my ear, sharing memories and secrets, like we used to do. Jessica moved away shortly after our confrontation, too ashamed to face me or our mutual friends. But sometimes late at night, I still find myself hoping my phone will ring with one more message from Lily's number, even knowing it was fake, even knowing the pain it caused. There was something beautiful about hearing her voice again, about feeling like she was still part of my world, even if only for a few minutes. That story's over, and I honestly don't know how to feel about it. On one hand, what Jessica did was cruel and manipulative, using someone's grief against them like that. But on the other hand, you can understand the desperation, the need to feel connected to someone. You've lost the technology angle, makes it even more disturbing, because it means anyone with enough audio samples could potentially weaponize our memories of deceased loved ones against us, speaking of technology gone wrong. Our next story comes from someone who discovered their smart home devices were recording much more than they bargained for. I found out my Alexa has been recording private conversations and someone's been listening to them. Like most people, I have several smart devices scattered around my house. Alexa in the living room, Google Home in the kitchen, smart doorbell security cameras, the whole setup that's supposed to make life more convenient. I never really thought about privacy concerns because, hey, if you're not doing anything wrong, what's there to worry about, right? That naive attitude changed completely last month when I got a notification from Amazon about unusual activity on my account. Apparently, someone had been accessing my Alexa recordings remotely, downloading hours of audio files from my device over the past several months. I didn't even know Alexa kept recordings beyond the brief clips needed to process voice commands, but it turns out every conversation that happens near the device gets stored in Amazon servers. I logged into my account to check what had been recorded and found thousands of audio files dating back over a year. Most were short clips of me asking Alexa to play music or set timers, but scattered throughout were much longer recordings, conversations with friends, family members, phone calls, arguments with my ex-boyfriend. Intimate moments that should have been completely private. But here's the terrifying part. Someone had been systematically downloading the most personal recordings they'd skipped over the mundane stuff, like grocery lists and weather requests, and focused specifically on conversations about my work, my relationships, my financial situation, my health problems, my family drama. Every private detail of my life had been catalogued and stolen. I immediately called Amazon's customer service, and the representative confirmed that someone had indeed been accessing my recordings from an IP address that wasn't mine. They'd been doing it for months using what appeared to be legitimate account credentials. Somehow, they'd gotten hold of my Amazon login information and had been mining my Alexa data like it was their personal surveillance system. The customer service rep helped me secure my account and delete all stored recordings, but the damage was already done. Months of private conversations had been compromised, and I had no idea who had them or what they planned to do with that information. That's when things got really scary. A few days after I discovered the breach, I started receiving text messages from an unknown number, messages that referenced specific things. I'd said in conversations that Alexa had recorded. One text said, "Heard you're having trouble with your boss. Maybe you shouldn't talk so much about work drama where people can listen." Another said, "Your mum seems worried about your drinking habits. Maybe you should take her advice." Whoever had my recordings was now using them to mess with my head, proving they'd been listening to everything I went to the police. But they said without more concrete threats, there wasn't much they could do. The person wasn't technically blackmailing me, just letting me know they had access to my private life. So I hired a private investigator to trace the IP address, and what we found was worse than I'd imagined. The person accessing my recordings was my neighbour David, who lived 3 houses down. We'd been friendly over the years, chatted at block parties, borrowed each other's tools occasionally, but I'd never considered him a close friend. Turns out David worked in its security and had been running some kind of sophisticated operation targeting smart home devices. Throughout our neighbourhood, he'd figured out how to intercept Wi-Fi signals and crack passwords, giving him access to multiple households' devices. When the police searched his house, they found recordings from at least 12 different families, detailed notes about everyone's schedules, habits and personal information, and evidence that he'd been selling some of this data to identity thieves and stalkers. David had been living next door to me for 5 years, quietly collecting intimate details about my life and the lives of everyone around us. He knew when we went to work, when we went on vacation, what we argued about, who we were sleeping with, what medications we took, what we were afraid of. The most disturbing part was his notebook's pages and pages of handwritten observations about each household, like he was conducting some kind of anthropological study of suburban life. Family at 142 Oak Street argues about money. Every Tuesday evening, woman takes anxiety medication. Husband works late Thursdays, probably having an affair. Family at 156 Oak Street. Teenage daughter sneaks out Friday nights. Parents don't know. She's drinking, mother has gambling problem, father considering divorce. He turned our entire neighbourhood into his personal reality show, documenting our private moments and selling our secrets to the highest bidder. David was arrested and charged with multiple counts of cyberstalking and identity theft. But the knowledge that he'd been listening to my most private conversations for months still haunts me. I've removed all smart devices from my house now, and I've become almost paranoid about digital privacy. But sometimes I wonder how many other Davids are out there quietly collecting our data, mining our private lives for profit or entertainment. The scariest part isn't even the technology, it's how someone can live right next door to you for years, smile and wave when you pass on the street, and secretly be documenting every intimate detail of your existence. That story wraps up, and honestly, this is why I have trust issues with technology. The idea that your neighbour could be sitting 3 houses away, listening to your private conversations through your own devices is absolutely horrifying. The detail about him keeping handwritten notebooks like he was conducting research on, everyone makes it even more disturbing because it shows how systematic and deliberate the whole operation was, and the fact that he was selling people's personal information to stalkers and identity thieves takes it from creepy neighbour behaviour to full-blown criminal enterprise. This story comes from someone who thought they were helping a lost child, but discovered something much more sinister. A little girl keeps showing up at my door, asking to use the phone, but when I try to help her, she disappears. I live in a quiet residential neighbourhood where kids play outside until dark, and everyone knows everyone else's business. So when a little girl I'd never seen before started showing up at my front door, it immediately caught my attention. She looked to be about 7 or 8 years old, with long dark hair and wearing what appeared to be a school uniform. Navy blue jumper, white shirt, knee-high socks, the kind of outfit that suggested she came from a private school somewhere nearby. The first time she knocked on my door was a Tuesday evening around 6:30. I was making dinner when I heard the soft tapping. She was standing on my porch looking upset and asked very politely if she could use my phone to call her mum. Of course, I said, and invited her inside, but when I turned around to get my phone from the kitchen counter, she was gone. I checked the front porch, the yard, even walked down the street a little way, but there was no sign of her anywhere. It was like she'd simply vanished 2 days later. She was back, same time, same request, same polite demeanour, but this time I was ready. I kept my phone in my hand while talking to her and asked for her mum's number. She recited a local number clearly and confidently, but when I dialed it, the recording said the number was not in service. When I looked up from my phone to tell her this, she was gone again. Over the next 2 weeks, this became a pattern. The little girl would appear at my door, always around 6:30, always asking to use the phone, but every time I tried to actually help her, she would disappear the moment I looked away. I started asking neighbours if they knew who she was, if anyone had a daughter matching her description, but nobody had ever seen her. Everyone agreed it was strange because our neighbourhood is small enough that we all know each other's kids. That's when I decided to do some investigating. I started keeping track of exactly when she appeared and noticed. It was always on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always at the same time, always wearing the same school uniform. I also realised that she never actually entered my house. Despite my invitations, she would stand in the doorway or on the porch but never cross the threshold. On the 4th Thursday, she appeared. I tried a different approach instead of offering to help. I asked her name and where she lived. "My name is Sophie," she said in that same polite voice. "I live on Maple Street with my mum, but I can't find my way home." Maple Street was only 3 blocks away, so I offered to walk her there, but she shook her head and insisted she just needed to use the phone. This time, I decided to test something. I told her my phone was broken, but that my neighbour across the street could probably help her. She looked confused for a moment, then said very matter-of-factly, "No, it has to be your phone." That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. The next Tuesday I was ready with my own phone recording when she knocked. I opened the door and immediately started filming. The little girl went through her usual routine, asking to use the phone, explaining that she needed to call her mum, but this time I captured something that made my blood run cold. When I played back the video later, the porch appeared empty. There was no little girl in the footage, just me talking to empty air, asking questions and responding to answers that weren't there on the recording. I looked like someone having a conversation with an invisible person, but I could see her clear as day. While it was happening, she was real solid, standing right in front of me. I showed the video to my neighbour, Carol, who's lived on this street for 30 years, and she went completely pale. Carol told me that 15 years ago, a little girl named Sophie Martinez had been walking home from St. Mary's private school when she was struck by a car just 2 blocks from my house. She died instantly, and the driver never stopped. Sophie had been wearing her school uniform, navy blue jumper and white shirt when it happened, and according to the police report, she'd been trying to get to a phone to call her mother. When the accident occurred, Carol said that for years after the accident, people in the neighbourhood reported seeing a little girl in a school uniform asking to use their phones, but the sightings had stopped about a decade ago. Until now, I haven't seen Sophie since I recorded that video, but sometimes, on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, around 6:30, I'll hear soft knocking at my door when I look through the peephole. There's never anyone there, but I can feel someone waiting on the other side. I've thought about moving, but something keeps me here. Maybe it's the idea that Sophie is still trying to complete that last phone call home, still trying to reach her mother after all these years. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just pretended to dial the number, let her believe the call went through, told her that her mum was on the way. Maybe that would have given her the peace she needed to finally go home. That story ends there, and honestly, this one gave me chills because there's something so heartbreaking about a child's spirit still trying to complete one simple task after 15 years. The detail about her only appearing on Tuesdays and Thursdays makes you wonder if those were the days she normally walked home from school. And the fact that she insists it has to be That specific person's phone suggests she's stuck in some kind of loop, trying to recreate the moment she never got to finish. I've got another story that just came in. And honestly, it might be the most disturbing thing I've read all week. My teenage daughter has been sleepwalking, but she's been having conversations with someone in our backyard. Sleepwalking runs in my family. So when my 15-year-old daughter, Kelsey, started doing it about 6 months ago, I wasn't immediately concerned. My sister used to sleepwalk as a kid, and it was mostly harmless. She'd wander around the house, maybe go to the kitchen for a snack, then go back to bed. But Kelsey's sleepwalking was different from the start. It always happened around 2 in the morning, and she'd always head straight for the back door. I'd find her standing in our backyard, just staring into the darkness beyond our fence. At first I thought she was just disoriented, so I'd gently guide her back inside, and she'd go to bed without waking up. But then I started noticing that she'd spend longer periods outside sometimes, up to an hour just standing there in her pyjamas. Even when it was cold or raining, she never seemed bothered by the weather, just stood there completely still. Facing the woods behind our property last month, I decided to follow her outside to see exactly what she was doing. And that's when I discovered she wasn't just standing there. She was talking to someone. I could hear her voice clearly, having what sounded like a normal conversation, asking questions, pausing to listen to responses, then continuing the discussion like she was chatting with a friend. But there was no one else in the yard. The first time I witnessed this, I assumed she was just talking to herself, the way some people do when they're dreaming. But as I listened more carefully, I realised her responses were too specific, too reactive to be one-sided. She'd say things like, "Oh really? When did that happen?" Or "I never thought about it that way." Or "That must have been scary for you." She was clearly responding to information she was receiving from somewhere. I started recording these conversations on my phone, and when I played them back during the day, the pattern became even more disturbing. Kelsey was discussing things she couldn't possibly know about. In one recording, she talked about a house fire that happened before she was born, describing details about the family who lived there, and how they escaped in another conversation. She mentioned the name of a child who had drowned in the creek behind our neighbourhood decades ago. But the most unsettling part was how comfortable she seemed during these exchanges. She wasn't afraid or confused. She talked like she was catching up with an old friend, sharing stories and asking about things that had happened since their last conversation. When Kelsey was awake, she had no memory of these nighttime chats. If I asked her about sleepwalking, she'd just shrug and say she slept fine. I started researching the history of our property to see if there might be some explanation for what Kelsey was experiencing, and what I found made my skin crawl. Our house was built on land that used to be part of a much larger estate. In the early 1900s, the original property had included several buildings, including a small schoolhouse where local children attended classes. In 1923, there was a tuberculosis outbreak that killed 7 children from the school. The bodies were buried in a small cemetery on the property, but when the land was subdivided and developed in the 1970s, the cemetery was relocated, except according to the historical records, not all of the graves were moved. The developer had apparently missed several burial sites that were deeper in the woods, and those remains were never relocated when they built our neighbourhood. They just built around them. I realised that Kelsey might be talking to children who had been buried on our property for over a century. But here's what really scared me. The conversations were becoming more frequent and more detailed. Kelsey was spending longer periods outside, and the discussion seemed to be getting more personal. In recent recordings, I could hear her talking about her school life, her friends, her worries about college. She was sharing intimate details about our family, with whatever she was communicating with. And then last week, something changed. Instead of just standing in one spot, Kelsey started walking. During her sleepwalking episodes, she'd move through the yard following some kind of path that only she could see sometimes, stopping to crouch down like she was examining something on the ground. One night I followed her as she walked in a specific pattern through our backyard, and I realised she was tracing the outline of something rectangular about the size of a small building. She was walking the perimeter of where the old schoolhouse used to stand. That's when I decided we needed to move. I didn't tell Kelsey the real reason we were leaving, just said I'd gotten a job opportunity in another state. But the night before we packed up the moving truck, I heard her outside having one final conversation. This time, I could hear her crying. She kept saying things like, "I don't want to leave you here, and I promise I'll come back to visit and thank you for being my friend," when no one else understood me. Whoever, or whatever, she'd been talking to for months had become important to her, and leaving felt like abandoning a friend. We moved 3 states away, and Kelsey's sleepwalking stopped immediately. She sleeps through the night now, and seems happier, more relaxed, like a weight has been lifted from her shoulders. But sometimes late at night, I wonder about those children, buried in the woods behind our old house. Whether they're still waiting for someone to talk to, whether they miss the conversations they had with my daughter. And I wonder if Kelsey misses them too, because sometimes I catch her staring out windows at night, like she's looking for someone who isn't there. That story's finished, and honestly, the idea of a teenager having nightly conversations with children who died a century ago is both heartbreaking and terrifying. The detail about her tracing the outline of the old schoolhouse suggests she was somehow connected to their memories of that place. And the fact that her sleepwalking stopped completely after moving indicates this wasn't just a medical condition, but something tied specifically to that property. Let me share a story that came in just yesterday, and it might explain why some people develop such intense phobias without any clear reason. I've been terrified of mirrors my entire life, and I just found out why. For as long as I can remember, I've had an irrational fear of mirrors, not just discomfort, but genuine terror, to the point where I couldn't have any reflective surfaces in my living space. I covered all the mirrors in my childhood bedroom with sheets, and as an adult, I've lived in apartments where I've removed or covered every mirror. People always asked why, and I never had a good answer. I'd just say mirrors made me uncomfortable. But the truth was more complex than that. Whenever I looked in a mirror, I felt like something was wrong. Like the reflection wasn't quite right, somehow. It wasn't that I looked different or distorted, but there was always this sense that something else was looking back at me, something that wasn't me. My family thought it was just a quirky phobia that I'd grow out of, but the fear only got stronger. As I got older, by the time I was in college, I couldn't even walk past storefront windows without feeling anxious last month. My grandmother passed away, and while cleaning out her house, I found a box of old home movies from when I was a toddler. I hadn't seen most of these videos before, so I decided to digitize them and see what memories they might hold. Most of the footage was exactly what you'd expect. Birthday parties, family gatherings, me learning to walk and talk, but there was one video that stopped me cold. It was filmed when I was about 2 years old and showed me playing in my grandmother's living room. But what caught my attention wasn't me, it was my behaviour around the large antique mirror that hung on the wall. In the video, I kept looking at the mirror and talking to it like there was someone there. I'd wave at my reflection point, at it, and carry on conversations with whatever I was seeing. But here's the disturbing part. My reflection in the video didn't match my movements. When I waved with my right hand, my reflection waved with its left. When I pointed up, my reflection pointed down. It was subtle enough that an adult might not notice, but watching it back decades later, the discrepancy was obvious. My reflection was doing different things than I was doing. I called my grandmother's neighbour, who had been close friends with her for 40 years, and asked if she remembered anything unusual about that mirror. Her response made my blood freeze. She told me that mirror had come from an estate sale after a family died in a house fire. The previous owners had specifically warned people that the mirror was haunted, that children would often act strangely around it, talking to their reflections, and sometimes screaming when they looked into it. My grandmother had bought it anyway, because it was beautiful and expensive, but she'd always noticed that young children seemed disturbed by it. The neighbour said that after I'd stayed at my grandmother's house several times as a toddler, my parents had mentioned that I'd developed an intense fear of mirrors. They thought it was just a phase, but it never went away. She also told me something that made me sick to my stomach. The family who had died in the house fire where the mirror originally came from had included 2 young children, and according to the police report, those children had been found in the room. With that mirror, I went back to my grandmother's house and stared at that mirror for the first time in decades, trying to see what my 2-year-old self had been so afraid of. The reflection looked normal, but there was something unsettling about the way the light hit the glass, something that made me feel like I was being watched. I ended up taking the mirror with me, not because I wanted it, but because I needed to understand what had happened to me. As a child that night, I set up a camera pointed at the mirror and left it recording while I slept when I reviewed the footage. The next morning, what I saw explained everything around 3 in the morning. The mirror's reflection showed movement, even though the room was empty, shadows shifting behind the glass, like someone was walking around in the space behind the mirror. But the most disturbing part was, near the end of the recording, for just a few seconds, the reflection showed the clear image of 2 small children standing behind where I would have been sleeping. They looked to be about the same age. I was in that old home video, and they were waving at the camera. The same way I used to wave at the mirror when I was 2 years old. I got rid of the mirror the next day, donated it to a thrift store, because I couldn't bring myself to destroy something that might contain the spirits of those children. But now I understand why I've been afraid of mirrors. My entire life, my subconscious remembered what my conscious mind had forgotten, that mirrors can sometimes show us things that aren't there, or maybe things that are there but exist in a different space than the one we can see. I still don't have mirrors in my home, and probably never will, because now I know that my fear wasn't irrational. It was a warning from my childhood self about something I was too young to understand, but old enough to remember. Wow, honestly, the idea that a childhood phobia could be rooted in supernatural experiences you're too young to consciously remember is genuinely chilling. The detail about the reflection not matching the child's movements in the home video suggests that whatever was in that mirror had been interacting with children for decades, and the fact that the fear persisted into adulthood shows how deeply these early experiences can affect us. Here's the next story I got in store. My therapist has been recording our sessions, and I found the recordings being sold online. I've been seeing Dr. Reynolds for anxiety and depression for about 8 months now, and honestly, she seemed like the perfect therapist. Understanding professional always made me feel heard during our weekly sessions. I was making real progress, working through some childhood trauma and relationship issues. Last week I was browsing Reddit when I came across a post in a mental health support group. Someone was asking for advice about finding recordings of their therapy sessions online. Apparently they'd discovered that their therapist had been secretly recording sessions and selling them to some kind of research company. The post included a link to a website that claimed to sell authentic therapy session recordings for educational purposes and out of morbid curiosity. I clicked on it. What I found made my stomach drop. The website was organized by therapist location and specialization, and when I clicked on my city, there was Dr. Reynolds listed as a contributing provider with dozens of session recordings available for purchase. Each recording was described with basic demographic information about the patient and the issues discussed, but no names were used. Still, the descriptions were specific enough that anyone who knew me well could probably identify which recordings were mine. 28-year-old female discussing childhood emotional neglect and current relationship anxiety. 30-something woman working through trust issues stemming from parental abandonment. The timestamps matched perfectly with my appointment schedule. I felt sick realizing that strangers had been listening to my most vulnerable moments, my deepest fears, my most painful memories, all packaged and sold like entertainment. I immediately downloaded one of the recordings listed under Dr. Reynolds, and sure enough, it was my voice discussing things I'd never told anyone else except her in that particular session. I talked about being sexually assaulted in college, something I'd never reported or even acknowledged until therapy. The recording captured every detail, every tear, every moment of breakthrough, as I finally admitted what had happened to me. And now that intensely personal moment was being sold online for $19.99. I spent the next few hours going through the website and found recordings from at least 12 different patients, all seeing Dr. Reynolds, all discussing deeply personal trauma, all being sold without their knowledge or consent. Some of the session descriptions were even more disturbing than mine. 15-year-old male discussing suicidal ideation and self-harm behaviours. Middle-aged woman processing recent sexual assault and PTSD symptoms. Elderly man working through grief after spouse's suicide. The website claimed these recordings were being used for educational purposes to help train new therapists, but there were no safeguards. No verification that buyers were actually mental health professionals. Anyone with a credit card could purchase access to people's most vulnerable moments. I called Dr. Reynolds' office the next morning and confronted her directly about what I'd found. At first she tried to deny it, claimed she had no idea how those recordings could have ended up online. But when I told her I'd actually listened to one of my own sessions, she went completely silent. Then she tried to justify it. She said the recordings were being used to advance mental health research, that the company had assured her all identifying information would be removed, and that she was helping to train the next generation of therapists. I pointed out that the recordings clearly weren't anonymous, that anyone who knew me could identify my voice and story, and that she'd never asked for my consent to record our sessions, let alone sell them. That's when she admitted the truth. She'd been struggling financially. Her practice was barely breaking even, and the recording company had offered her substantial money for authentic therapy session audio. She said she'd convinced herself it was for a good cause, but she knew it was wrong. I hung up and immediately called the state licensing board to file a complaint. Within a week, Dr. Reynolds had lost her license and her practice was shut down, but the damage was already done. Hundreds of therapy session recordings had been sold, and there was no way to get them back or control who had access to them. I also discovered that several other therapists in the area had been participating in the same scheme, selling their patients' most private moments to fund their struggling practices. The worst part wasn't even the violation of privacy. It was realizing that someone I'd trusted with my deepest traumas had commodified my pain, turned my healing journey into a product to be bought and sold. I've started seeing a new therapist, but it took months before I could open up again. Every session, I wondered if this conversation too would end up for sale online, if my new vulnerabilities would become someone else's entertainment. Sometimes I search for my own recordings on similar websites just to see if they've spread to other platforms, and occasionally I find them listed on new sites with slightly different descriptions but the same intimate details of my life. The company that originally bought the recordings claimed they were using them for legitimate research, but there's no way to verify that, and no way to control how the audio might be used in the future. My voice discussing my sexual assault could be out there forever, accessible to anyone willing to pay for it, and there's nothing I can do to take it back. That story is over. And honestly, this one hits different, because it's about the violation of what should be the safest space in someone's life. Therapy is supposed to be sacred, confidential, a place where you can be completely vulnerable without fear. And the idea that therapists were secretly recording and selling those moments is absolutely sickening. The financial desperation angle doesn't excuse it, but it does explain how professionals could rationalize such a massive betrayal of trust. Our next story comes from someone who thought they were helping their elderly neighbor but discovered a much darker truth. My neighbor asked me to water her plants while she was away, but I found something horrible in her basement. Mrs. Garcia has lived next door to me for about 3 years, and she's always seemed like the perfect neighbor. Quiet keeps her yard. Neat occasionally, brings over homemade tamales during holidays. She's in her 70s and lives alone. Since her husband passed away a few years back last month, she mentioned she was going to visit her daughter in Phoenix for 2 weeks and asked if I could water her plants and bring in her mail. I was happy to help, and she gave me a spare key with detailed instructions about which plants needed water, and how often the first few days went smoothly. I'd stop by every other morning, water the plants in her living room and kitchen, and stack her mail neatly on the counter. Her house was always immaculate, almost obsessively clean, with everything in its proper place. But on the fourth day, I noticed a smell. It was faint at first, just a slightly off odour that I assumed was old food in the refrigerator, or maybe a clogged drain. But as I moved through the house, the smell got stronger, and seemed to be coming from somewhere below. Mrs. Garcia had never mentioned anything about a basement, but there was a door off the kitchen that I'd assumed was a pantry. When I opened it, I found stairs leading down into darkness. The smell was definitely coming from down there. I almost didn't investigate. I almost just closed the door and pretended I hadn't noticed anything. But the odour was getting worse, and I was worried there might be a gas leak or some other safety issue. So I found a flashlight in her kitchen drawer and went downstairs. What I found in that basement still gives me nightmares. The space had been converted into what looked like a medical facility. There were several hospital beds with restraints, multiple IV stands, cabinets full of medical supplies and equipment I didn't recognise, but that wasn't the worst part. There were people down there, 3 elderly individuals lying in the beds unconscious or heavily sedated, connected to feeding tubes and catheters. They looked emaciated, like they'd been there for months, maybe longer. All 3 appeared to be in their 80s or 90s, and from the personal belongings scattered around each bed, it was clear they'd been living down there for an extended period. I immediately called 911, and when the paramedics arrived, they confirmed that all 3 individuals were alive, but severely malnourished and dehydrated. They were rushed to the hospital while police secured the scene. What the investigation revealed was beyond disturbing. Mrs. Garcia had been running an illegal elder care operation, taking in elderly people whose families couldn't afford proper nursing home care. She'd promise affordable in-home care, but then keep them sedated in her basement, collecting their social security checks and any payments from desperate family members. The 3 people I found had been reported missing by their families months earlier, but the police investigations had gone nowhere because Mrs. Garcia had forged documents suggesting they'd moved to other states. She'd been keeping them unconscious, with various medications stealing their identities and essentially holding them prisoner. While their families thought they were receiving care elsewhere, the basement had been soundproofed, which explained why I'd never heard anything during my previous visits to her house, and she'd installed a separate ventilation system to manage the odours. When police searched the rest of her house, they found detailed records of at least 8 other elderly individuals who had been in her care over the past 5 years. Some of those records ended abruptly, with notes about funeral arrangements and cremations that Mrs. Garcia had apparently handled privately. The 3 people I found survived, but they required months of rehabilitation to recover from their ordeal. One of them was able to tell police that Mrs. Garcia had convinced their family they were receiving excellent care while slowly poisoning them to keep them compliant. Mrs. Garcia was arrested in Phoenix when she tried to board a flight to Mexico. Apparently she'd been planning to disappear once she realised her operation had been discovered. During her interrogation, she showed no remorse, claimed she was providing a valuable service to families who couldn't afford proper elder care, and insisted that she'd kept the people in her basement comfortable and safe. The trial revealed that she'd made hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years collecting payments from families while providing virtually no actual care, just enough medication to keep her victims unconscious and alive. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole, but the psychological damage to the survivors and their families will last forever. I still live next door to that house, which has been empty since Mrs. Garcia's arrest. Sometimes late at night, I can't help but think about those 3 people lying in that basement for months, while I walked past the house every day, completely unaware of what was happening just a few feet below ground. The worst part is how normal everything seemed, how perfectly Mrs. Garcia played the role of a caring elderly neighbour, bringing tamales and asking about my family, while secretly running a torture chamber in her basement. That story ends there. And honestly, This is one of those cases where reality is more horrifying than any fictional story. You could imagine the systematic nature of it, the forged documents, the soundproofed basement, the years of operation right under everyone's noses. It's like something out of a horror movie, except these were real people, suffering, real families, desperately searching for their missing loved ones. The detail about her showing no remorse and claiming she was providing a service makes it even more chilling. Let's move to this story, which comes from someone who discovered that their childhood imaginary friend might not have been imaginary. After all, I found my old childhood drawings, and my imaginary friend appears in photographs from when I was little. Cleaning out my parents' attic last weekend, I came across a box of my childhood artwork, dozens of crayon drawings and finger paintings from when I was between 4 and 7 years old. Most of them were typical kid stuff houses with triangle roofs, stick figure families, cats that looked like circles with legs, but scattered throughout were detailed drawings of a boy who appeared over and over again. In different scenes, he looked to be about my age, with dark hair, and was always wearing what appeared to be old-fashioned clothing. Knickers, suspenders, the kind of outfits you might see in photographs from the 1920s or 30s in every drawing. He was standing slightly apart from me. And my family never quite integrated into the scene, but always present watching. I remembered him clearly. His name was Thomas, and he'd been my constant companion from about age 4 until I started school. He'd play games with me, tell me stories about his life, and keep me company. When my parents were busy, my parents always assumed Thomas was a typical imaginary friend, and encouraged the relationship, thinking it was good for my development as an only child. But looking at these drawings as an adult, something felt off about how consistently I'd portrayed him. The clothing was too specific, too historically accurate for a 4-year-old to have invented, and his facial features were remarkably detailed and consistent across dozens of drawings. Curious, I showed the drawings to my mum and asked if she remembered Thomas. Of course, she said. He was your imaginary friend for years. You used to have whole conversations with him, set a place for him at dinner, insist that we leave space for him in the car. But then she said something that made my skin crawl. You know, what was strange though, sometimes when you were playing with Thomas, I'd hear 2 distinct voices coming from your room, like there was actually another child in there with you. I felt a chill run down my spine and asked if she had any photographs. From that time period, she pulled out several photo albums from when I was 4 and 5, and as we flipped through them, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In several of the photographs, there was a faint figure standing near me. Not clear enough to make out features, but definitely the outline of a child, about my size, standing just outside the main focus of the camera in one photo taken at my 5th birthday party. You could clearly see me talking to someone off to the side, but the adults in the photo were all looking at me, like I was talking to empty air. Except there in the corner of the image was the unmistakable shadow of another child. My mum stared at the photographs, looking confused. I never noticed that before. She said those shadows. I always just assumed it was a trick of the light or double exposure. We went through more albums and found at least a dozen photographs where similar shadowy figures appeared always near me, always child-sized, always positioned exactly where Thomas would have been standing. Based on my body language and where I was looking that night, I couldn't sleep, so I started researching the history of our childhood home. What I discovered made everything click into place. In 1932, a 7-year-old boy named Thomas Mitchell had died of pneumonia. In the house where I grew up, he'd been sick for weeks, confined to what was now my childhood bedroom, and had died there surrounded by his family. According to the obituary, Thomas had been described as a cheerful child who loved games and storytelling. Exactly the personality traits I remembered about my imaginary friend. The photograph included with the obituary showed a boy who looked exactly like the child I'd been drawing for years, same dark hair, same facial features, same old-fashioned clothing. Thomas hadn't been imaginary at all. He'd been the ghost of a child who died in my bedroom decades before I was born. I called my parents and told them what I'd discovered, and my mum went completely silent. Then she admitted something she'd never told me before. When we first moved into that house, you were only 3, and you immediately started talking about the boy in your room. You knew details about him that you couldn't possibly have known, like his name and the fact that he'd been sick. We thought you were just making up stories, but you were so insistent, so detailed in your descriptions that sometimes it gave us chills. She said they'd considered moving, but I seemed happy, and Thomas seemed harmless, so they decided to stay. The friendship lasted until I started school, at which point Thomas gradually faded from my life. But now I wonder if he's still there in that house, waiting for another lonely child to keep him company. My parents still live there, and sometimes when I visit I'll walk past my old bedroom and feel like someone's watching me. Not in a threatening way, but with the kind of longing you might expect from a child who's been alone for decades. I've thought about trying to communicate with Thomas again, but I'm not sure I want to open that door. Some friendships are meant to stay in childhood, even if one of the friends never got the chance to grow up. That story brings our session to a close. And honestly, the idea that what we dismiss as childhood imagination might sometimes be genuine supernatural encounters is both beautiful and haunting. The detail about the historically accurate clothing and the shadowy figures in photographs suggests that children might be more open to these experiences than adults who rationalize everything away. There's something deeply sad about a child spirit waiting decades for friendship. Here's the next story that honestly looks pretty fake, but you guys let me know what you think about it. My childhood friend has been dead for 10 years, but keeps texting me. I need to get this off my chest because it's driving me absolutely insane. And I don't know who else to tell. Without sounding completely unhinged, my best friend Riley died in a car accident when we were both 17. That was 10 years ago. And I went to the funeral. I saw the body. I watched them lower the casket into the ground. I grieved. I moved on with my life. Or at least I thought I did. About 3 years ago, I started getting text messages from Riley's old phone number. At first I thought it was some sick joke, or maybe the number got reassigned to someone else, who found old conversations and decided to mess with me. The messages were simple things like, "Hey, how are you?" or "Remember when we used to sneak out to the old bridge?" I blocked the number immediately, but then the messages started coming from different numbers, always the same writing style, always referencing memories that only Riley and I shared, things we never posted online, things we never told anyone else. The messages got more frequent and more specific last month. I got one that said, "I miss our Tuesday movie nights. We always watched horror films in your basement, and you'd make that terrible microwave popcorn that burned every time nobody else knew about. Our Tuesday tradition. It was just something we did when her parents worked late." Then last week, I got a message that made my blood run cold. It said, "I know you still have my leather jacket, the one I left at your house the night before the accident. You kept it, didn't you? It still smells like my perfume." Here's the thing. I do still have that jacket. I never told anyone. I kept it. I never posted about it online. I've never even taken it out of my closet. It's hanging in the back behind all my other clothes, exactly where I put it. The day after the funeral yesterday, I got another message. It just said, "Look in the jacket pocket," so I did. And I found a folded piece of paper with an address written in Riley's handwriting, an address I'd never seen before. I drove to the address today. It's an old apartment building on the other side of town, the kind of place that looks like it should have been condemned years ago. I stood outside for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to go in. I finally walked up to apartment 4B and knocked. The door opened, and I swear on everything I hold dear, Riley answered the door. She looked exactly the same as she did 10 years ago. Same clothes, same hairstyle, same smile. She looked at me and said, "I've been waiting for you to find me. I told you I'd never really leave." I turned around and ran. I got in my car and drove straight home. And I haven't stopped shaking since that was 6 hours ago. I just got another text. It says, "Why did you run away? I thought you missed me too. I don't know what to do. I don't know what I saw. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if something impossible is actually happening. All I know is that my dead best friend is apparently living in apartment 4B and she's been texting me for 3 years. I'm scared to go back, but I'm more scared of what happens if I don't. That story just hits different, doesn't it? The idea that someone you've grieved and buried could somehow still be reaching out from beyond makes you question everything you think you know about death and what comes after. I can't imagine the terror of seeing your deceased friend standing in a doorway, like nothing ever happened. Part of me wants to believe it's just grief manifesting in impossible ways, but that jacket detail, that's what really gets me. How could anyone else know about something so personal and hidden anyway? Let's move on to something that might make you think twice about your daily commute. I think my Uber driver wasn't human. This happened last Tuesday night, and I still can't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with what I experienced. I keep going over every detail trying to make sense of it, but nothing adds up. I was leaving a late dinner with friends downtown and needed to get home to my apartment about 15 minutes away. Nothing unusual, just a regular Tuesday night in the city. I called an Uber and waited outside the restaurant. Like always, the car that pulled up matched the description in the app. Silver sedan, correct license plate. But when I got in, I immediately noticed the driver didn't acknowledge me at all. No hello, no confirmation of my destination, just started driving. I figured maybe he was having a bad night, or just wasn't talkative, so I settled into the back seat and pulled out my phone to scroll through social media. But then I started paying attention to the route he was taking. We were going the complete opposite direction. From my apartment, I tried to get his attention. Hey, excuse me. I think you're going the wrong way. My apartment is back that direction. But he didn't respond. Didn't even adjust the rear view mirror to look at me. I checked the app and it showed we were heading toward my destination. The little car icon was moving along the correct route on my screen, but I could see with my own eyes that we were driving through neighbourhoods I'd never been to before heading away from the city centre. I tried again. Hey driver, you need to turn around. We're going the wrong way. But still nothing. It was like he couldn't hear me at all. I started to panic and thought about jumping out at the next red light, but we weren't stopping at red lights. That's when I noticed we were driving through red lights and stop signs like they didn't exist, but other cars were stopping normally. I could see them waiting at intersections as we just sailed through. I thought maybe I was seeing things wrong. Maybe I was more tired than I realised. Then I looked at the driver more carefully. In the dim light from the dashboard, I could see his profile, but something was off. His head didn't move at all. Not even slight adjustments. Like a normal person driving, he sat perfectly still, hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. I leaned forward to try to see his face better, and that's when I realised he wasn't blinking. I watched for a full minute and his eyes never closed. Not once, just staring ahead with this completely blank expression. I started recording on my phone thinking I needed evidence of whatever was happening, but when I looked at the recording later, it just showed an empty driver's seat. The steering wheel was turning by itself, but there was no one sitting there. The strangest part was that, according to my phone's GPS and the Uber app, we were taking the normal route to my apartment, the one I'd taken dozens of times before, but I could see we were driving through industrial areas and empty fields that definitely weren't between downtown and my neighbourhood. After what felt like an hour, but the app said was only 12 minutes, we pulled up in front of my building. I got out quickly, and the driver finally spoke for the first time. He said, "Have a safe night," in this completely monotone voice. I looked back at him, and his eyes were solid black, no pupils, no iris, just black. I slammed the door and ran inside when I looked out my window. A few minutes later, the car was gone. I checked my Uber receipt and everything looked normal. The route, the time, the fare, all exactly what it should have been for a regular trip home. I even got the usual email asking me to rate my driver. But I know what I saw, and I know we didn't take the normal route. I know that driver wasn't human, and I have no idea how I actually got home that night. I've been taking the bus ever since. Something about that story makes my skin crawl. The idea that you could get it into what appears to be a normal rideshare, but end up in some kind of supernatural situation where reality doesn't match what you're experiencing. The detail about the empty driver's seat in the recording is what really gets me. How do you explain that? I'd probably never get in another Uber again after something like that. Let's move on to our next story, which takes place somewhere most of us spend a third of our lives. There's something living in my apartment walls. I moved into this studio apartment 6 months ago because the rent was incredibly cheap for the area and I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It's in an older building, but the unit was recently renovated with new paint, new floors, new fixtures. Everything looked perfect for the first few weeks. Everything was normal. I loved the place. It was cozy and quiet and exactly what I needed. But then I started hearing sounds coming from inside the walls. At first, it was just occasional scratching sounds late at night. I assumed it was mice or maybe pipes settling old buildings. Make noise, right? I ignored it and went about my business, but the sounds got more frequent and more deliberate. It wasn't random scratching anymore. It sounded like something was moving around in there, with purpose, like it was exploring or maybe building something. I called the landlord, and he sent someone to check for rodents. The exterminator found no evidence of mice or rats, no droppings, no chew marks, nothing. He said the walls were clean and suggested maybe it was just the building settling. But I knew it wasn't settling because the sounds were getting louder and more complex. I started hearing what sounded like whispers coming from the wall behind my bed, are very quiet, but definitely voices. I couldn't make out words, but it was definitely some kind of communication. I pressed my ear against the wall one night, and I could hear what sounded like multiple voices having a conversation. They would talk for a while, then go silent, then start up again, like they were taking turns. I became obsessed with figuring out what was happening. I started recording the sounds with my phone, and when I played them back, I could hear the voices more clearly. They were speaking English, but in this strange rhythm, like they were reciting something. One night, I heard my name being whispered from inside the wall behind my headboard, clear as day. Someone or something in there knew who I was. That's when I decided to investigate the building layout. I got copies of the floor plans from the city planning office and discovered something disturbing. There was space behind my walls that wasn't accounted for in any of the apartments. According to the plans, there should be a narrow corridor running behind my bedroom wall, but it wasn't part of any unit. It wasn't marked as maintenance space or storage. It was just empty space that existed between the apartments. I started researching the building's history and found out that it was originally built as a boarding house. In the 1920s, it was converted to apartments in the 1980s, but they didn't reconfigure all the internal walls. They just sealed off some of the old corridors and built over them. So there are these hidden spaces throughout the building that no one is supposed to have access to, but somehow something or someone is living in them. Last week, I heard footsteps in the wall, moving from one end of my apartment to the other, like someone was walking along inside the wall parallel to my living space. I followed the sound, and it stopped right behind my kitchen. Then I heard a voice much clearer than before. It said, "I know you can hear me," and it was definitely coming from inside the wall right behind my refrigerator. I moved the refrigerator and found a small hole in the wall about the size of a quarter, like someone had been watching me through it. I shined a flashlight into the hole and saw what looked like a narrow corridor with makeshift furniture and blankets. Someone has been living in the walls of my building probably for months or years, watching the tenants through small holes they've drilled. I have no idea how many people are in there or how they get in and out. I called the police, but they said without evidence of actual trespassing, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I talk to the landlord again, but I'm scared that if I make too much noise about this, whoever is in there might decide to come out. I've been staying at friends' places for the past few days, but I have to go back. Eventually, I can't afford to break my lease and move somewhere else. I just don't know what to do about the fact that I'm apparently sharing my living space with people who have been secretly watching me. The worst part is wondering how long they've been there and what they've seen me do in what I thought was the privacy of my own home. Okay, that one genuinely made me uncomfortable. The thought that someone could be living in the hidden spaces of your building, watching you through tiny holes, is absolutely terrifying. It's like something out of a horror movie, but grounded in just enough reality to make it believable. I'd probably tear down every wall in that apartment, looking for more holes. If that happened to me, there's something so violating about the idea that your most private moments might not be private at all. Alright, we've got time for one more story before we wrap up. This first part and this next one is going to stick with you. I found a box of photos in my new house that show my future. I bought my first house 3 months ago. It's a small 2-bedroom place built in the 1960s. The previous owner was an elderly woman who passed away, and her family just wanted to sell quickly, so I got a good deal. When I was cleaning out the basement, I found a shoebox tucked behind the water heater. It was full of old photographs, which isn't unusual. Old houses always have forgotten items left behind by previous owners. But when I started looking through the photos, I realised they weren't old at all. They were pictures of me doing things I hadn't done yet. The first photo showed me standing in my kitchen, but I was wearing clothes I didn't own, and my hair was different, longer than it is now in the photo. I was cooking something at the stove and smiling at someone off camera. The second photo was me sitting in my living room, reading a book I'd never seen before. The furniture was arranged differently than how I have it now, and there were decorations on the walls that I don't have. There were dozens of photos all showing me in my house, but doing things I haven't done yet, or wearing things I don't own, or with people I don't recognise. But they were definitely me, same face, same build, same mannerisms. One photo showed me opening the front door to greet a woman with short red hair. I've never met anyone matching that description, but in the photo, I'm hugging her like we're close friends, or maybe more than friends. Another photo showed me in the backyard, planting flowers in a garden that doesn't exist yet. My yard is just grass right now, but in the photo, there's this elaborate flower bed with a stone border. The strangest photo showed me standing in what looked like a nursery. The second bedroom in my house is currently empty, but in the photo, it's painted yellow with a crib and baby furniture. I'm holding what appears to be an infant. I don't have kids, I'm not even in a relationship. But there I was in this photo, looking completely natural, holding a baby in what is currently my empty spare room. I tried to convince myself these were just photos of someone who looked like me. Maybe the previous owner had a relative with similar features, but the photos were definitely taken in my house. I could see specific details like the crack in the kitchen tile and the weird angle of the bathroom door. Then I found a photo that made me drop the entire box. It showed me standing next to a gravestone in what looked like the cemetery across town. I was placing flowers on the grave and crying. I drove to that cemetery and walked around until I found the exact spot from the photo. The gravestone was there, but it was blank. No name, no dates, nothing carved into it yet, but it was definitely the same stone, same shape, same position. I've been carrying the photos with me everywhere, trying to figure out what they mean. Are they predictions? Are they possibilities? Are they some kind of warning? The weird thing is that some of the smaller details from the photos have started happening. I bought a coffee mug last week, and when I got home, I realised it was the same mug I was holding in one of the photos. I got my hair cut yesterday, and without thinking about it, I asked for a style that would make it longer. I didn't realise until later that I was growing it out to match how it looked in the photos. Yesterday, I was at the grocery store, and I found myself buying seeds for flowers. The same flowers that were in the garden photo. I don't even like gardening, but something compelled me to buy them. I'm starting to think these photos aren't just showing me possible futures, they're somehow guiding me toward them, like I'm unconsciously making choices that will lead to these exact moments. The photo with the red-haired woman keeps haunting me, because I find myself looking for her everywhere I go, like I'm expecting to meet her soon. And when I do, I'll invite her over, and we'll become whatever we are in that photo. I'm scared about the photo with the baby and the one at the gravestone because I don't know if I'm supposed to try to prevent those futures or if they're inevitable. I've hidden the box, but I can't stop thinking about it. Every decision I make now feels like it might be leading me closer to one of those moments captured in the photos. I don't know if I should embrace whatever's coming or try to change course, but I'm starting to think it might not matter either way. That story sends chills down my spine because it plays with the idea that our future might already be written somewhere just waiting for us to catch up to it. The thought that you could stumble across photographic evidence of events that haven't happened yet is both fascinating and terrifying. I can't decide if those photos would be a gift or a curse. Would you want to know what's coming, even if you couldn't change it? The idea of seeing your own future laid out in photographs like that is both incredible and absolutely horrifying. Imagine knowing exactly what's coming but not being able to tell if you're choosing those paths or if they're choosing you. Anyway, let's keep going, because this next story is going to make you question everything you think you know about the people closest to you. My wife has been replaced and nobody believes me. I've been married to Jessica for 8 years and I know her better than I know myself, or at least I thought I did 3 weeks ago. Something changed, and I can't shake the feeling that the woman living in my house isn't actually my wife. It started with small things that I initially brushed off. She made coffee differently one morning, using sugar instead of the honey. She's preferred for our entire relationship. When I mentioned it, she looked confused and said she'd always used sugar. Then she couldn't find the spare key we keep hidden under the fake rock by the front door. A key she's used hundreds of times. She stood there looking genuinely lost until I showed her where it was. She acted like she'd never seen it before. Her handwriting changed overnight. I noticed when she left me a grocery list. Her normally neat cursive was replaced by blocky print letters. When I asked about it, she said her hand was sore. But it's been 3 weeks, and it's still the same unfamiliar handwriting. She forgot our anniversary. Not the date, but the significance. When I mentioned it was coming up, she smiled and nodded, but there was this blank look in her eyes like she was trying to remember what anniversaries were for her. The most disturbing change is how she interacts with our dog. Buster has always been Jessica's shadow, following her everywhere, begging for attention, but now he won't go near her. He hides when she enters a room and whimpers if she tries to pet him. Animals know things we don't. She's lost memories we made together last weekend. I brought up our trip to Colorado from 2 years ago, and she had no recollection of it at all. Not just fuzzy details, but complete blank confusion. Like I was describing someone else's vacation, her sleep patterns changed completely. Jessica used to be a light sleeper who woke up if I so much as rolled over. Now she sleeps like she's unconscious. I tested this by turning on lights and playing music right next to the bed. She didn't even stir. She's developed new mannerisms that feel foreign, the way she holds her fork, how she arranges items on counters. Even her laugh sounds different. It's higher pitched and comes at odd moments, like she's not sure when laughing is appropriate. I found her standing in our bedroom closet yesterday, just staring at the clothes, like she didn't recognize them. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was deciding what to wear, but she stood there for 20 minutes, touching fabrics, like she'd never felt them before. The breaking point came when I mentioned her sister's name, and she asked who I was talking about. Jessica adores her sister, Claire. They talk every day. They've been best friends since childhood. But this woman looked at me with genuine confusion and asked if Claire was someone from work. I called Claire to test this, and when she asked to speak to Jessica, the conversation was stilted and awkward. Jessica kept saying things like, "Oh yes, that sounds familiar." And I think I remember that while Claire grew increasingly concerned, Claire pulled me aside later and said, Jessica seemed like a completely different person. She noticed the same things I did, the changed mannerisms, the missing memories, the way she seemed to be pretending to know things. She should know instinctively. I've tried talking to friends and family, but they think I'm being paranoid, or that Jessica is going through some kind of mental health crisis, they suggest therapy or counselling. But how do you explain to a therapist that your wife has been replaced by someone who looks exactly like her? The physical resemblance is perfect. Every freckle, every scar, even a small birthmark on her shoulder that only I would know about, but everything else is wrong. Like someone studied her appearance but couldn't capture her essence. She caught me staring at her yesterday and asked if something was wrong. I wanted to scream that everything was wrong, that whoever she was, she needed to tell me what happened to my real wife. Instead, I just said, I was tired, I've started documenting everything. Writing down the differences, taking photos, comparing her current behaviour to old videos I have of us together. The evidence is mounting, but I don't know what to do with it. Last night I pretended to be asleep and watched her. She sat on the edge of the bed for over an hour, just staring at her hands, like she was studying them, trying to figure out how they worked. I'm terrified that something happened to the real Jessica, and this imposter is here for reasons I can't understand. I'm also terrified that I'm losing my mind and seeing changes that aren't really there. But Buster knows something is wrong, and dogs don't have psychological breakdowns. I don't know how to prove what I know, or even who I would prove it to. All I know is that the woman sleeping next to me every night isn't the woman I married, and I'm running out of ways to pretend everything is normal. That story hits on one of the most primal fears we have as humans. The idea that someone we love and trust could be replaced without our knowledge, and we'd be the only one to notice. It's like a psychological horror movie playing out in real life. The detail about the dog avoiding her really gets to me, because animals do sense things we miss. They don't lie or pretend, they just know when something isn't right. I can't imagine the isolation of knowing something so fundamental is wrong, but having nobody believe you. Our next story takes us into territory that makes you wonder about the spaces we think we know. I work night security at a mall, and the stores change when nobody's looking. I've been working as a night security guard at Westfield Shopping Centre for about 2 years now. It's a pretty standard gig, walking around an empty mall, checking doors, making sure nobody breaks in. But over the past few months, I've noticed things that don't make sense. The first strange thing I noticed was that stores would be different from one night to the next. Not dramatically different, but small changes that shouldn't happen overnight. A clothing store might have different mannequins in the window, or a restaurant might have new menu boards. I started paying closer attention and realised the changes were happening. While I was making my rounds, I'd walk past the store and notice the display, then come back an hour later and something would be different. Last month I was doing my usual 2 a.m. walk when I noticed the bookstore had books I'd never seen before. The entire front display had changed from bestsellers to old leather-bound volumes with titles in languages I couldn't identify. I made a note of it and checked again on my next round. The books were back to normal current bestsellers and magazines, like nothing had happened. But I know what I saw. Then I started noticing that some stores would have their lights on. When they should be dark, I'd see movement inside figures walking around rearranging merchandise. But when I'd get closer, the lights would be off and the store would be empty. The jewellery store is the worst offender. I've seen people in there dozens of times moving between the display cases, examining items, but the alarm system shows the store has never been breached. The owner insists nobody has access after hours 3 weeks ago. I decided to hide and watch. Instead of just walking my rounds, I positioned myself behind a planter where I could see the main corridor and waited. Around 3 a.m, the stores started coming alive. One by one, lights would flicker on and people would appear inside, not breaking in, just suddenly there like they belonged. The strangest part was that they looked like they were from different time periods. The clothing store filled with women in 1950s dresses, examining the modern clothes. With confusion, the electronics store had men in suits from the 1980s, trying to figure out smartphones. The bookstore had people in Victorian-era clothing, reading contemporary novels. They weren't ghosts exactly. They seemed solid real, but displaced, like they were shopping in the wrong decade. They'd pick up items, examine them, put them back. Some looked frustrated, others seemed delighted by the unfamiliar merchandise. I watched for 2 hours as these anachronistic shoppers browsed through stores that catered to their specific time periods, even though the actual merchandise was contemporary. It was like the stores were adapting to serve customers from the past. Around 5 a.m, they all started to fade away, not disappearing dramatically, just becoming less solid until they were gone. The lights in the stores went out one by one, and everything returned to normal. I tried to tell my supervisor about what I'd seen, but he just said I needed more sleep and suggested I cut back on caffeine. I started bringing a camera, but whenever I try to record these events, the footage comes out blank or corrupted. The mall's history doesn't explain what I'm seeing. It was built in 1987 on land that used to be farmland. No tragic events, no reason for supernatural activity, just a normal shopping centre that apparently serves customers from multiple time periods. Last week I tried interacting with them. I walked up to the jewellery store window while the vintage shoppers were inside and tapped on the glass. They all turned to look at me, but their faces were confused, like they could see me but couldn't understand why I was there. One woman in a 1940s dress walked to the window and pressed her hand against the glass from the inside. I put my hand up to match hers and I could feel cold radiating through the glass. She mouthed words I couldn't hear, then shook her head sadly and walked away. I've started leaving small items around the mall during my shifts, a modern pen near the bookstore, a current magazine by the clothing store by morning. They're always gone, but I never see anyone take them. Yesterday, I found something that made my blood run cold tucked under a bench near the food court. Was a receipt from the jewellery store, dated 1962, for items that don't exist anymore. The store wasn't even built until 1987. The receipt was made out to Margaret Holloway for a pearl necklace and matching earrings. The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink looked fresh, like it had been printed yesterday. I looked up Margaret Holloway and found her obituary from 1963. She died in a car accident one day. After the date on the receipt, she never got to pick up her jewellery. I don't know why this mall attracts shoppers from the past, or how they're able to interact with stores that didn't exist in their time. All I know is that my job has become a lot more complicated than just checking locks and watching for break-ins. I've started timing my rounds to avoid the active hours between 3 and 5 a.m, but sometimes I still catch glimpses of them in my peripheral vision, people in outdated clothes browsing through stores that somehow cater to their era. The worst part is wondering if I'm becoming part of whatever temporal anomaly exists here. If someday I'll be the security guard from 2024 walking through a mall that serves shoppers from 2074. I still need this job, but I'm not sure how much longer I can handle knowing that the empty mall I'm supposed to be guarding is actually bustling with customers. From decades past, that story gives me chills because it combines the eerie atmosphere of an empty mall with the unsettling idea that time might not work the way we think it does. The image of shoppers from different eras browsing through stores that adapt to serve them is both beautiful and terrifying. In a way, I'd probably quit that job immediately after seeing Victorian era, people reading modern books. There's something so haunting about the woman pressing her hand against the glass, trying to communicate across decades. Let's move into this story. I found a website that shows what people are doing right now in real time. I'm a software developer and I spend a lot of time exploring the deeper parts of the internet, places most people never see, while following some obscure links for a project I was working on. I stumbled across a website with a simple URL, just a string of numbers and letters. The homepage was completely black, except for a single search bar. There were no instructions, no branding, no indication of what the site was supposed to do. I almost closed it, but curiosity got the better of me. I typed in my own name just to see what would happen and immediately regretted it. The screen filled with a live video feed of me sitting at my computer typing into the website. The angle was from above and slightly behind, like there was a camera mounted on my ceiling, but I don't have any cameras in my apartment. I could see myself in real time moving my mouse clicking keys, even the expression of shock on my face as I realised what I was looking at. I waved my hand and watched myself wave on the screen. There was no delay, it was happening in real time. I slammed my laptop shut and looked around my apartment, searching for hidden cameras, checking every corner, every device, anything that could be recording me. I found nothing, but when I opened my laptop again, the website was still there, still showing my empty chair. I tried typing in other names, people I knew, and the results were horrifying. It showed my co-worker Janet eating lunch at her desk in her office building. It showed my neighbour walking his dog down the street. It showed my sister reading a book in her living room, 3 states away. Every person I searched for appeared on screen, going about their normal daily activities, completely unaware they were being watched. The video quality was perfect, crystal clear, high definition, feeds from angles that shouldn't exist. I tested it with celebrities, politicians, random names I found online. Every single search returned a live video feed of that person doing whatever they were doing. At that exact moment, I watched a famous actor. I'd always admired brushing his teeth in his bathroom. I saw a politician I recognised having what appeared to be a private argument with someone off camera. I witnessed strangers in their most private moments, sleeping, showering, having intimate conversations. The website seemed to have access to everyone everywhere at all times, regardless of location, privacy settings, or security measures. It was like having godlike surveillance powers over the entire human population. I tried to figure out how it worked, looking at the page source, checking for clues about servers or hosting, but the code was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was almost like it was written in a programming language that didn't exist. I spent hours searching for information about the site online, but found nothing. No mentions on forums, no references in academic papers, no traces anywhere else. On the internet, it was like this website existed in complete isolation. The most disturbing part was realizing that if I could watch anyone, then someone else could be watching me. The site had to have other users, people who might be searching for my name right now, seeing me in my most vulnerable moments. I became paranoid about everything I did, knowing that somewhere someone might be watching me through this impossible surveillance system. I covered my laptop, camera, put tape over my phone, started closing curtains and checking over my shoulder constantly. But the worst realization came when I started recognizing patterns in the feeds. I was watching the same angles, the same impossible camera positions in every location. It was like the entire world was wired with invisible cameras that only this website could access. I tried to trace the website's ownership, looking up domain registration information, checking IP addresses, following digital breadcrumbs, but every lead ended in dead ends or nonsensical data. It was like the site didn't exist in any official capacity last week. I made the mistake of showing it to my friend David. I thought maybe he could help me figure out what it was or how it worked, but when I tried to access the site with him there, it wouldn't load. We tried different browsers, different computers, different internet connections, but the website only appeared when I was alone. It was like it was somehow tied to me, specifically designed for my access only. I started documenting everything, taking screenshots, saving video recordings, but every piece of evidence I tried to capture would corrupt or disappear the moment I tried to share it with anyone else. Yesterday, I discovered the most terrifying feature of all. At the bottom of the page, there was a small link I'd never noticed before that said upload. When I clicked it, a dialog box appeared asking me to select a video file. I realized this wasn't just a surveillance website. It was a two-way system. People could upload their own feeds, contribute their own impossible camera angles to this global surveillance network. I don't know who created this website or how it's possible to have real-time access to every person on Earth. I don't know if it's some kind of government project, an alien technology, or something else entirely. What I do know is that privacy is an illusion, and somewhere in the digital void there's a website that proves we're all being watched all the time by anyone who knows where to look. I've tried to forget about it, tried to go back to my normal life, but the knowledge haunts me every moment. I know that right now someone could be typing my name into that search bar and watching me write these words. The website is still there, still accessible, still showing me things I was never meant to see, and I can't decide if I should expose it to the world or keep it secret forever. If you made it through all these stories without questioning your own memories or checking over your shoulder, you're definitely braver than I am. Thanks for spending time here with me, exploring these dark corners of human experience. And if you're still watching, consider subscribing because I've got plenty more stories for tomorrow. I'll give another special thanks to the members for supporting the channel even further, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.